Hi, everybody. Are you hot in here? I know, I keep asking that question when we're in here. Sorry. All right. Welcome to this panel. I feel like it's going to be, or I hope it's going to be, one of the most special one. It is special, very special for me. And I'm going to share with you why. I'll start with sharing with you why, so you can understand. So my name is Nora Gherbi. I'm the founder of Chronicles. I've been a partner of ChangeNOW since its inception, and I provide content, among other things. I work with an incredible team, obviously, as you've seen. ChangeNOW is made of an incredible team. And when we started working on the program for this year, I felt like there was the time to create this panel, and I'm so glad that we did with Nora, that's in the audience, because it feels like it's the time for us to be heard. And when I mean us, I'm also speaking of myself. I am the daughter of two Kabyle people, and I'm also French and Canadian. And when I studied, I first studied in Canada in cultural institutions, and I was trying to identify or at least express the Canadian cultural identity. And I was warmly welcomed by fellow Indigenous people with open arms, because obviously, being an Indigenous myself. But what was interesting is that when I would speak to first or second or third generation Canadians, they would always joke and say, "Ooh, your thesis is going to be very small because there's not much to say about our cultural identity, or our history is so short and so small in comparison to Europe." But in the reserves and within the community of Cree, I was welcomed by the Cree people. This is not at all what was said. They were very excited to share their history and their culture, which is very rich and very, very ancient and ancestral, as a matter of fact. So today with this panel, I wanted to take this opportunity to honor Indigenous people in general, humanity, because Indigenous people are part of this planet, and we're all part of this planet, whether we're first-generation Canadian, second-generation, or Indigenous people. And I really hope you're going to enjoy this panel. We put a lot of heart into it. And thank you again, Nora, for being part of this great program. So what are Indigenous people? Indigenous people are also referred to as First People, First Nation, Aboriginal, Native, Indigenous, Autochthonous. They are culturally distinct ethnic groups whose members are directly descended from the earliest known inhabitants of a particular geographic region, and to some extent maintain the language and culture of these original people. The term indigenous, in its modern context, was used by Europeans who used it to differentiate indigenous people of the Americas and the European settlers of the Americas, and from the Africans who were brought to America as slaves. There are today approximately 5,000 indigenous nations throughout the world, in all continents. And in 2007, the UN issued a declaration on the rights of indigenous people. And I'm mentioning it because yesterday we had a great panel here about human rights. And this declaration on the rights of indigenous people was made to guide member state national policies to the collective rights of indigenous people, including their rights to protect their culture, identities, languages, ceremonies, and access to employment, health, education, and natural resources. And when we started to create this panel, we had all wild ideas that were not logistically possible, like, let's have a member of each indigenous community be present. Not possible. Let's have a member of each continent, a representative for each continent present. Not possible. But we managed to have a fair amount of people today, and we will all be ambassadors of the collective. But just to name a few, because I know we couldn't have everyone here, we have indigenous people everywhere in the world, even in the Arctic. From the Abagusi in Kenya, to the Hadza in Tanzania, to the Sandawe, to the Hamara in Ethiopia, to the Berbers in Mazirin, which contains various tribes, which I belong to the Tubu of Chad, to the Siwi Berbers in Egypt and the Copt, to the Kadu people in Sudan, the list goes on. So today we'll have representative that will be with us that are going to be, and not just Indigenous people, we also have representatives that are Indigenous in their own way, starting with Amanda, who is an anthropologist. She holds a PhD in sociology, is from Rio. We'll have Hindou Oumarou, Ibrahim, who is an expert in the adaptation and mitigation of Indigenous people to climate change. She has a very long list of achievements, which I won't rhyme off. They're probably as long as the list of Indigenous people in this world. And last but not least, who will connect with us remotely, Sherman, an Oglala Lakota Sioux chef, known as the Sioux Chef, who is a cookbook author, a promoter of Indigenous cuisine. He's also the founder of the Indigenous food education business and catering, the Sioux Chef, as well as the nonprofit North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. So to start, I would like to welcome with me on stage Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim. Hi.
Hi.
How are you? Not too hot, I hope?
Yeah, I'm coming from Chad, so, this is like the normal weather.
So maybe you can tell us more about everything that you do on a daily basis to when we were preparing, you and I, and you asked me a very, very good question. What is the purpose? What is the aim of this panel? And I don't know if I answered well, but I knew immediately asked the right question. And I think sometimes it's not about having the right answers, but having the right questions. So you do a lot of work in the scope and to represent Indigenous people as a group. Also, you do this collectively. And actually, when I mentioned this morning, I was getting a lot of signs. My sister sent me a photo of my daughter wearing the traditional Berber Kabyle outfit. And so I looked into my closet and I pulled it out. And you said...
I have the same.
The same, because?
Because in Indigenous culture, we exchange our clothes, we exchange our tradition to make them work in any Indigenous nations.
Right, and as you can see, we love color.
Right, you see how we love the colors?
Yes. And so you also mentioned that one of your projects is to go and meet as many Indigenous people as possible around the world with the aim of?
Knowing each other and living in harmony with nature. So yeah, let me start with that. I'm so happy to be with all of you, and I'm very happy to be with my sister from Brazil who is joining us here. So as Indigenous nations, we are in the 7 sociocultural regions, as you said. And the purpose is the same. We are the peoples who are living in harmony with the nature. We have one thing together. You can be in the Arctic, or in the savannas, or in the Sahel regions. You can be in the mountain of Himalaya, or you could be in the tropical forest of Brazil or of Congo Basin. For us, nature is the only one thing we rely all together, we depend on it, and we protect it without getting paid. When they ask me, you are very passionate about Indigenous peoples, I'm like, this is not the way of saying things. It is not a passion for me. It is a way of living. It is how I grow up, and it is how many Indigenous peoples grow up together like this. I give you the examples. So Indigenous peoples represent 5% of the world's populations. We are protecting a quota of the earth's land. And we are the guardian of 80% of the world's biodiversity. And when I say 80%, maybe it's modest because we are protecting more than that. And the reason why we are protecting it, we are not too many, and how we are protecting it, that's what the people used to ask. So For example, when I come from my peoples who are a nomadic pastoralist, we live from one place to another one to find water and pastures. We are across countries. So our way of living, when we displace from one place to another one, so that means all the place we are protecting it. Maybe we are saying in the Western culture, 20 to 25% of the agriculture emitting the carbon in the atmospheres. But our own agriculture, when we move, we do have the cattle. It's carbon positive, and it's zero negative in the atmospheres. Why? Because our cow dung fertile the land, give the ecosystem the way of getting regenerated in a natural way. And when we produce a milk, so this milk is zero carbon and even positive to the nature. When we produce a meat, it is zero carbon and even positive to the nature. So that's why we are the guardian of the ecosystems. We are the guardian of the earth. And that's why indigenous peoples around all the world doing the same thing, from the coral reef to the Amazon, to the glaciers, and to my peoples.
Thank you. One of the things I also mentioned, which is probably why I talk so much, is that storytelling has been valued in traditional ways of knowing indigenous culture, and it is seen as a primary means to pass on knowledge over generations. Through research on the resilience of indigenous youth and their relationship to culture, identity, and land, there are stories created and recreated. Maybe you can tell us a story about your experience as an indigenous person.
Right. So we are a storytelling people. So that's why I'm always saying when I have to present something in PowerPoint, I get a struggle because I have to read through things. But when I have to talk, I'm always reminding how much the history that I take from my mom, from my grandmother, etc. And it is not only talking. It is the history that help us to live in harmony between us and also us with the other species. I give you some of the examples. Maybe some of you, not all of you, before you come here, you wake up the morning and you just like look at if it's going to be raining today, because this is the season where it's rain in Paris, or if it's going to be sunny, right? But in our communities, we do have this knowledge, but not by looking in a smartphone. I used to say that my grandmother is the best application ever that I have. She don't need electricity, sure, that is true, and she didn't need Wi-Fi, that is true. But she's the best application ever because she can just tell you by observing the birds' migrations, by observing the cloud positions, by observing the fruits of the trees, or just flowers, that if it's going to be raining or not. Because she's nomadic, she don't have like a closed house like this to live. So she have to understand the nature in order to plan her journey. So for example, if like we are today, there is sun and it's going to rain in the next 2 hours, what we do? We just look at the small insect, the ant, in the soil. And when the ant start taking them eggs and moving to their needs, so that means exactly in the next 2 hours, it's going to rain. So for us, it is a sign. You have to pack your stuff because you know it's going to rain. And when you know also, you have to move from one season to another one. So each season has his own sickness. Like when it's becoming cold, here what I understood in France, so people start giving a vaccine to the old peoples because the cold is coming, because they are going to get cold, so they have to prevent by vaccine. So we don't have the vaccine, but we know how to prevent any sickness that are coming. So we see it by preventing the position of the stars. And this is amazing for me always when I talk with my community there. There are millions of the stars in the sky. but we follow only 28 of them. So 28, each of them come out and in, you know how many days. And when one of them coming, you know that the season is changing, so you have to do the vaccine. Even myself, Hindou, if I'm in Paris or in New York. So from my knowledge, I know I have to take the breakfast with honey for one season, with milk with another one, with beans for another one. So that can prevent me from the seasonal sickness that is coming up. So we do have these preventions from ourselves, and we know exactly to prevent that. So all that we learn is from the storytelling, from the nature, and we have to transfer it to the next generations in order to keep our knowledge going and our planet saving. So this storytelling is our culture, but it is also the identity of us that are helping us to live in harmony with nature.
And it's also a way for survival. During my studies, I learned something that really struck me. And I'm just going to try to tell it again as I heard it. But apparently in the history books, when the first Europeans arrived in Canada, British Europeans would not communicate with Indigenous people because they thought, oh, they're wild, they're savages. We're not going to learn anything from them. We don't need them. And they really struggled. Some of them died. But apparently, and again, I don't know if it's the French Quebecer that twisted the story, when the French arrived, and that's why there is a distinction within Indigenous in Canada, we have what we call métis, which are Indigenous people and French people. The French apparently had said, well, the British are not communicating with them or exchanging with them to learn from them, to settle, to expand into this territory. We're going to do something else. We're going to communicate with them and even, obviously, enter a relationship with them. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been any métis. And that helped them navigate, because they knew that Native Indian people in Canada would be able to help them navigate through the winters, through the harsh winters, through the harvest. And I think that we're entering this territory again, large scale. If we want to survive, we need to do what was done then by the Métis people today, to integrate and to work with Indigenous people to survive.
I mean, I think we are in this stage of the crisis around the world. Coming from the health crisis that we all experience, and luckily today we are not wearing the mask. But just imagine yourself 2 months ago where you have to wear the mask, when you have to present the vaccine, when you have to do that. Not only in your country, but you have to do it everywhere. You are scared from your own family to do not see your own grandmother or your own child just because you don't want to get them sick. So this is the world crisis. The second crisis, we do have it about all the climate change, biodiversity loss, and it's impacting our food securities. And of course, when we talk about the food security and the impact, usually we just think that the developing countries, the poor peoples who are the most impacted, most vulnerable. But we saw that we all depend from the earth, and we all need the earth. Earth do not need us. From the Ukraine and Russia, what is happening in the developed world? All the prices increase, from the wheats to the oils to whatever, because people understood that the globalization that we create is not the one who is helping us to thrive. If we wanted to thrive, we need to learn how to live as indigenous peoples does. We do not take from the nature always. We give back. We take only what we need. We never take the accessibility. We give back to the nature. And we need to learn indigenous peoples use their own wisdom and knowledge to do not think about 2050, 2030, but we think more. Because in my own culture, and I learned that in many indigenous cultures the same, when I'm growing up, I have to learn over 7 generations of my past. So my grandpa, my great-grandpa, 7 of them, not only learning their names, but learning what they did in their life. And if I have to take a decision, I have to think about next 7 upcoming generations. Otherwise, my decisions is not fair. I cannot think about my children and without thinking about the next one, because otherwise it's not the long term. So how this world can learn about the long term, it is not 2050, 2030, or it is not about the next election after 5 years, but it is how we are building the future. So this one is a lesson learned from the indigenous peoples also, they must learn. So when they come to the colonization, it is the benefit that they are looking first. But they have to look beyond the benefit that we are just extracting, but what are we giving to the nature? And maybe I can give you one thing. All of us here, what are we going to give back from today? So we must think about that. Maybe we take metro, maybe we take taxi, maybe we take something else. But what are we giving back to the nature? Are we protecting it in one or another way? So we must have this thing in our mind, and that's what indigenous peoples does have in their mind in every single decisions.
So when we were planning again, and we were discussing with Nora, we spoke a lot about ancestry. As a matter of fact, so Nora, who's part of the ChangeNOW team, is a partly Cariña people, indigenous people in Latin America. Her great-grandmother, Maria Perez, was a healer, and Nuria's mother, Belkis, is a naturopath. So we were laughing because it's like the modern-day version of healer. Obviously, Belkis doesn't use the technique that Nuria's great-grandmother was using. Nuria's great-grandmother, as a healer, would use all kinds of plants and would make all kinds of concoctions and mix things to heal the people around her. I think ancestry and obviously transmission and transgenerational access is a very important thing. You live in France now, sort of, kind of. And you obviously carry, there's actually a great quote from Maya Angelou that says that whenever you walk into a room, whether you're indigenous or not, by the way, you can do that, walk like you have all 300 years of ancestry behind you walking in with you. That's what we're doing today. We have all our ancestors in this room, and I know all of your ancestors are here too, because this is a moment for us all. So what would you say, what would you think your ancestor today, or what is the message that you feel you want to share today? The way that Belkis is carrying on her great-grandmother, and the way that Nuria is also a healer with all the work she does here.
I think it's like the ancestors are watching what we are doing. They are watching if we are taking their wisdom and using it in a fair way, or we are just like taking the wisdom to use it in a singular and egoist way. So that's why when I told you we have to think about the 7 past generations, so for us, you have to understand what they did, which legacy they left for us, and which kind of legacy you wanted to leave to the world. So how do you want the peoples to remember you, to remember your generations, like our parent generations? We are remembering them. They are the ones who are using the fossil fuel, who are encouraging all the big companies to extract, to make them rich, and to leave us with these disasters. And they are asking and calling. The new generation are taking the lead. The young people are working on the street, so they have to do it. So I think the ancestors are watching, and then they are saying, like, no, it is not the role of the young generation that you put them there. You have to take your responsibility. And this is also my message. Like, we have to take our responsibility. We have to hold them accountable, from the government to the private sectors who are continuing extracting and destroying our life. We must hold them accountable by any single way that we do have, by voting to the right peoples, by asking to all those companies to stop using the fossil fuel. There is no excuse. We have a clean energy. We have a clean technology. We have everything that we need. Which kind of excuse that they are using? They wanted to be, again, more riches, but there is no rich peoples when there is no peoples in the planet. So you are rich because you think that there are others who are poor. But if there is no poor, you are not rich anymore. So how we can hold them accountable to give this equity, equality of all the peoples. And that's what we call climate justice. We never admitted that, and we never want it, and especially in our communities, who is still living very simply, without even electricity, even without clean water to drink. Because they are still drinking the same water that the cattle and sheep that drinking, the human beings are drinking. And we are just like talking about those who can not talk about the earth, but who are going up to the sky to do tourism somewhere in another planet. So for me, it's really like, are we realistic? So we need to remind people to come and put their feet in the soil, because sooner or later, what our ancestors say, you do not own the land owns you. You will go back to the land. Either you will be rich, you will be poor. So you need to think about that and respect what the ancestors say and go back to the land as safe as also giving the space to the next peoples.
Thank you. Thank you. So I asked for an extra chair to be set on the stage because you very kindly offered to support, and I didn't mention her before because I needed to mention her on her own. She's so powerful. Because you wanted to support Kowawa, our sister, while she was speaking. So I'm going to invite you to sit in the orange chair. Yes. That way it'll be easier for you to leave because you're expected in another panel somewhere else.
Yes, but I will support my sister for at least the first 15 minutes before to leave.
Great. And our sister is Miss Kowawa Pupykary Apurinã. Her indigenous name is Kowawa, and it means fruit of the Jurubeba Braba. Please join me. And Amanda Diaz, please join me. So a little heads up. Kowawa speaks many languages. The first one is the language of the heart. Tu primer idioma es el idioma del corazón. But she speaks Portuguese, and Amanda, who's from Rio and who does work with Kowawa, will be translating while Kowawa will speak. But first, we're going to start with Amanda, and we're going to stay into the storytelling that we're trying to do today.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank ChangeNOW's team for inviting us. It's really an honor to be here today. So let me briefly present myself. You may be wondering. As Nora said, I hold a PhD in sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, as well as the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. I am an associate researcher for the Center for Social Sciences of Religion in Paris, and I'm a lecturer at the Catholic University in Paris and the Paris Institute of Political Studies. My doctoral research involved a comparison between Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and favelas in Brazil. And I worked with artists and activists from the favela and from the camp. Intellectuals, as I called them, intellectuals of the margins. And I'm an anthropologist, but I'm also interested in filmmaking because I feel that academic research remains limited to a very specific public, and it's necessary to talk to a wider public. So film appears to me as the good way to do this. So you might be asking yourselves, what does this have to do with indigenous people? So I'm getting there. A few years ago, and this is something I would not be saying in an academic conference. This is the first time I'm talking in a more personal way, because it makes sense here. So a few years ago, I started dreaming that I was swimming in Amazon rivers. And in these dreams, I was surrounded by Amazon indigenous peoples, and I was always very happy. I always felt, wow, how wonderful, I'm here again. That's a place I would go to in my dreams, and each time it would be wonderful. And that's how I became interested in indigenous people in Brazil. I have to say that until then, I did not know much about indigenous peoples. And this doesn't really say something about me. It says something about Brazilian society. So in Brazil, at the best, indigenous people, they appear as folklore, when not as drunk, lazy, acculturated. Until mid-70s, we actually thought they were destined to disappear and be assimilated in national society. So as I was doing research, I was really amazed to discover these over 300 indigenous peoples that live in Brazil that speak over 200 languages. And to discover their universe, I was watching films, reading indigenous authors, and something that really amazed me too was to discover that there are indigenous intellectuals, and that they're going to university, they're getting university degrees, master degrees, PhDs, all this in an effort to be heard. So they're learning the dominant society's codes so that they can speak for themselves and be heard. And as I had worked with intellectuals from the camps and the favelas, I thought I will work with indigenous intellectuals. As I said, we have this, it's evolving now, thanks to indigenous intellectuals' work. But we still have a lot of misinformation on indigenous peoples in Brazil. Kowawa wants to bring you a very positive message. So I have the bad job, just tell you what's actually happening right now in Brazil. So we are under a far-right government. Deforestation of the Amazon has never been this bad, to the point that the Pope Francis and French President Macron actually supported a campaign for the creation of a new international crime, ecocide. The mentality of Brazil's current regime is close to the one we had during the dictatorship, which means that they should just assimilate themselves to society, and their lands should be exploited for capitalism. And our president's speech inspires, if not legitimates, illegal land appropriation, logging, mining, and the killing of indigenous leaders. Yesterday, we were at the party, the changemakers night. I was with Kowawa. At some point, her phone rang. She said, oh, it's from Brazil. She answered. When she came, she just told me they have just murdered her cousin in his territory when he went to talk to people that were taking the wood. And he went there to say, you can't do that. So he was 26 or 27, I'm not sure. This was last night. And this is happening all the time, and medias are not talking about it. So she wants to give a positive message, and she will. I'm doing the bad job, of saying it's actually very important to look at these people, to hear them, to learn from them, but also to protect them. Well, I have a few. Thank you. I had a few numbers here, but I think that's enough. You can look on the internet if you want. But when to come back to my dreams, I was so worried with this situation. And in one of my dreams, I was swimming, and there were 3 indigenous children. And I said to them, I really want to help you. What can I do? And they said very clearly, help diffuse our cause. So I stayed with this and thinking, how? You know, I'm a researcher. I'm not this practical person that knows where to go and what to do. And I was doing research, thinking about this, when at some point I had another dream where a shaman told me, if you want to do something, you should wear an old jewel. I thought, okay. I woke up, I went to Google, I looked for old jewels. I thought they all looked very kitsch. I bought nothing, but I kept thinking about it. And at some point, a friend that's here called me and said, Amanda, there is this indigenous intellectual leader woman that's in Paris. Come and meet her with me for the Portuguese and to see how we can help her settle. So that's when I met Kowawa. And when I saw her coming in with her feathers and her presence, she has such a strong presence, I thought, maybe it's time I tell these dreams to someone. And I did. And she was very touched. She was really touched because she's doing her PhD, and I think most people come to her, and that's what she told me, they come to her and they talk about their positions. And she said, you came to me and you spoke my language. You told me about dreams. And she said, I have these old feathers earrings that I put in my luggage. I had no idea why. They're for you. So this is why I'm wearing them. I wear them every day since. I'm not trying to look indigenous. I'm following the guidance I had in my dreams. So that's it. That's how I met Kowawa, and we have developed a very strong relationship of trust, of mutual affection, of shared beliefs, of a shared desire to make a change, to work together in an horizontal way, not a vertical way. And this is maybe the occasion to tell you of our first, well, I think this is our first concrete collaboration, and we're both very honored to be here together. And another thing we're doing is we are making a documentary film together. So when I saw her coming, I thought this is the great occasion to do this. It was already my desire to make a film, but nothing really moved me enough to make this step. And as soon as I told her about this film, she was totally going for it. And this film is going to be about her journey in Paris, about our encounter. That's something I love about Paris, is that I meet people I would not meet in Brazil. I don't see how I would have met her in Brazil. We met here. So it's about the encounter of 2 women with different trajectories, but who share so much and the essential, I think. And it has 3 main dimensions, if I can say. The political one, she's here because she has had her life threatened twice, and so she's protecting herself. We're going to have elections in Brazil in October, and she's here until November, protecting herself. She's here doing part of her PhD studies, which is amazing because it's not only Europeans that can study Brazil. And that's why I studied Middle East first. I didn't want to be a Brazilian that studies Brazil. I wanted to be a Brazilian that studies Middle East. So done that, now I can study Brazil. So it's about reversing this colonial relationship. So she's doing her PhD. And it's also about this enchanted world, about this communication that passes through dreams. I'm noting my dreams, she's noting her dreams. They communicate about our dreams. And that's the film we're making, and we're looking for collaborations. So feel free. If you're producers, financiers, diffusers, we are here.
And speaking of storytelling, I know you have to translate what Kowawa has prepared for us.
Yes. So I will pass the word to Kowawa. Kowawa wanted to present you with shamanic words. She has, now that I've said the earthly things, And as I said, Kowawa is is an indigenous leader. She has a very important activist work in Brazil. She is an anthropologist. She has 2 university degrees, 2 master's degrees. She's working on her PhD. She has co-founded a foundation for her people that works in her territories. And she also has activism where she makes handmade kind of notebooks, and all the money that she gains from selling them goes to helping the women in her territories.
So the way we're going to do it is that Kowawa will say a few words from her work that she's done. I'm not going to give anything away. And you will translate paragraph by paragraph. Kowawa?
Tá. Waikai Nerimane. Eu sou Kowawa, Pupykary, Apurinã. E vou lhe presentear hoje, nesse dia de sol, de uma história, de um pequeno fragmento da sabedoria do meu povo. Também meu povo Apurinã, no Brasil, também conhecido como Pupykary. A maior de todas as nossas divindades, Tsurá, nosso Criador, estava tecendo um brinquedo com a palha do quinari, da palmeira de Buriti, quando de repente foi engolido por esse brinquedo que se transformou numa voraz e grande cotori, cobra coral, venenosa e gulosa. Nessa ocasião, a cobra tira. Nessa ocasião, os irmãos reuniram todos os animais da floresta para tentar furar a barriga da cobra grande e gulosa. A voraz e gulosa cobra engordava e caía comendo um a um dos animais. E foi quando a inesperada e diminuta ave, que chamamos de Paratyari, martim pescador, conseguiu a façanha da libertação de Tsurá e de outros, tirando das entranhas da barriga da gulosa e egoísta cobra coral.
I will offer you a small fragment of the wisdom of my Pupykary people, better known in Brazil by the name Apurinã. The greatest of all our deities, Tsurá, the Apurinã god, our creator and creator of the universe, was weaving a toy with the straws of Kinhari, Buriti palm tree. When suddenly he was swallowed by this toy that turned into a voracious and great kotori, coral snake, poisonous and greedy. On that occasion, his brothers gathered all the animals of the forest to try to pierce the snake's belly and take Tsurá out of it. The voracious, greedy snake gained weight and went on eating, one by one, his brothers, as well as all the forest's animals. It was swallowing everything. It was only when the unexpected and little bird that we call Pachari, kingfisher, achieved the exploit of releasing Tsurá and the others, taking them out of the bowels of the greedy and selfish snake's belly.
O pássaro martim pescador é uma ave que mede 42 centímetros e tem um peso de 304 gramas. Seu bico chega a 8 centímetros. E sua pequenez e fragilidade contrasta com a imensidão gigantesca das florestas. A sua audácia foi com seu bico lento e aos poucos conseguiu rasgar uma abertura de onde Tsurá e todos os outros presos saíssem, quando muitos duvidavam e se riu do minúsculo pássaro, diante da pretensiosa, gulosa cobra com a perseverança e persistência, conseguiu o feito da libertação de Tissurá.
The kingfisher bird measures 42 centimeters long and weighs up to 340 grams. Its beak reaches 8 centimeters. The bird's smallness and fragility contrasts with the gigantic immensity of the forest and its huge trees. The kingfisher bird is almost imperceptible within the cosmic infinity of the Amazon rainforest. His audacity allowed it to, slowly and gradually, tear an opening with its beak, through which Tsura and all the other prisoners left, when many doubted and laughed at the tiny bird in face of the great greedy snake. With perseverance and persistence, it achieved the feat of liberating Tsura.
Com essa instigante história, com essa instigante e insólita cena transmitida pela sabedoria do meu povo indígena Apurinã, que habitamos tradicionalmente as terras e territórios ao longo da bacia do Purus e seus afluentes, na região da Amazônia, do nosso país Brasil, gostaria de lhe oferecer palavras de magia. Quer dizer, palavras encantadas, como dizem na nossa tradição, para lhe apresentar um pouco da nossa forma de viver e estar nesse cosmo. Nossos valores civilizacionais e pensamentos nesses distintos tempos e diversos espaços, engolidos por artefatos que ganharam vida própria e se transformam em gulosas cobras insaciáveis.
With this thought-provoking and unusual scene, transmitted by the wisdom of my indigenous people, Apurinã, who traditionally inhabit the lands and territories along the Purus River basin and its tributaries in the Amazon region of our country, Brazil, I would like to offer you words suffused with magic, enchanted words, as we say in our tradition, to introduce you a little bit to our way of being and living in this cosmos, our civilizational values and thoughts, in these different times and various spaces that have been swallowed by artifacts, which gained a life of their own and became greedy, insatiable snakes.
O povo Apurinã integra as mais de 305 etnias do Brasil. Somos indígenas, somos povos originários, sim, somos brasileiros, mas principalmente somos múltiplas civilizações indígenas, indígenas que falam 274 línguas, com histórias e sociedades plurais que compõem uma imensa diversidade cultural, social, ambiental e territorial, como também foi florido com a diáspora afro-brasileira e suas diversas etnias e culturas que veio se constituir o que chamam de Brasil.
The Apurinã people are part of the over 305 indigenous peoples of Brazil. Yes, we are indigenous. Are we native peoples? Yes, we are Brazilians, but mainly we are multiple indigenous civilizations that speak more than 274 languages with plural histories and societies that make up an immense cultural, social, environmental, and territorial diversity, which was also enriched by the Afro-Brazilian diaspora, its diverse ethnicities and cultures.
Não somos selvagens, nem somos bons selvagens, e nem somos os maus selvagens da natureza. Somos civilizações humanas e somos humanos como vocês, mas somos diferentes e diversos.
We're not savages, not the good savages, neither the evil savages of nature. We are human civilizations, and we're humans like you, but we are different and diverse.
O mundo está sendo engolido pela gulosa cobra grande do consumismo melancólico e passivo, do individualismo e do próprio abandono de si mesmo, do egoísmo, administrado e organizados pela marcha bélica do niilismo ativo devastador.
The whole world is being swallowed by the greedy great snake of melancholic and passive consumerism, of individualism, of oneself's own abandonment, of selfishness, administered and organized by the war march of devastating active nihilism.
Nós, do povo Apurinã, aprendemos a buscar o envolvimento dentro da leveza e alteridade profunda, não apenas do outro ou da outra, mas de todos os seres vivos e encantados. O pensamento para nós é coletivo, não é a propriedade de alguém ou de um indivíduo. O pensamento para nós é coletivo. Praticamos o exercício de cuidar de nós, humanos e não humanos. E tudo está atravessado pela correnteza dos afetos e pelas águas fluentes de cuidar de si e do outro. A humanidade ocidental de vocês se perdeu com o tempo, esquecendo seus abrigos e canais originários da terra, valores, bosque, montanhas, rios, animais e de onde vieram, e a consciência dos vínculos sutis que liga aos lugares e à natureza.
We of the Apurinã people learn to seek involvement within lightness, deep otherness, not only of the other person, but of all living and enchanted beings. For us, the thought is collective. It's not the property of someone, of an individual. We practice the exercise of taking care of each other, humans and non-humans. And everything is crossed by the currents of affections and the fluent waters of caring for oneself as well as one another. Your Western humanity has gone down with time, forgetting its shelters, forgetting Earth's native canals, valleys, woods, mountains, rivers, animals, forgetting where you came from and the awareness of the subtle bonds that links you to nature.
Vocês precisam se reencontrar com seus valores mais nobres e se abrirem às conexões com suas origens e serem receptivos à diferença, pois de diversidade foi feito e será feita a vida entre nós no planeta.
You need to rediscover your noblest values, to connect with your origins and become receptive to differences, because our lives in this planet have been, are, and will be made of diversity.
O cuidado do planeta é cuidar de todos nós, com as nossas fragilidades e pequenez. É reconhecer isso, é reconhecer a si mesmo, coletivamente. Eu venho do rio Purus, afluente do rio Amazonas, da região amazônica do Brasil. Este rio chega a um rio maior e encontra mais à frente outros mares e se ligam com outros continentes. Faço um rezo para que tudo continue a existir, para que todos os diferentes de mim possam olhar e desfrutar essas belezas e saber como nós, povo Apurinã, sabemos e fazemos parte desse universo.
To take care of this planet is to take care of all, with our fragilities and smallness. To recognize this is to recognize yourself collectively. I come from the Purus River, a tributary of the Amazon River, from the Amazon region of Brazil. This river arrives at a larger river and meets further down the seas, and these seas talk to the king's sun and the stars in the mornings, connecting with other continents. I pray that all this will continue to exist, so that others will be able to look at and enjoy these beauties, and know, as we Apurinã people know, that we are part of this place in the universe.
Temos de olhar os lugares do planeta, não como reservas de capital, mas como parte dos nossos próprios corpos e vidas, dádivas cósmicas oferecidas por as divindades estrangeiras, tremendas, desconhecidas, e que nunca mais retornarão para nos presentear do nosso gratuito e generoso ser.
We must look at the planet's spaces not as capital reserve, but as part of our own bodies and lives, cosmic gifts offered by foreign deities, tremendous, unknown, and who will not return to give us free and generous gifts.
A catástrofe está em marcha. E este pequeno e complexo ponto azul do sistema solar cheios de vida e de belas paisagens e de diversas culturas está em crise, respirando tão amarguradamente. Não se trata apenas de uma crise climática, aquecimento global, destruição das florestas, ecossistema, poluição das águas, descarte massivo de lixo, tudo que alimenta a cobra grande, gulosa e insaciável, que com sua boca ávida engole, engole, engole cada vez mais pessoas, subjetividades, culturas.
The catastrophe is in motion, and this small and complex blue dot of the solar system, full of lives, beautiful landscapes, and diverse cultures, is in crisis, breathing ever so bitterly. It's not just about climate crisis, global warming. It's the destruction of the forest and ecosystems, the water pollution, the massive waste disposal, all to feed the great greedy snake, insatiable with its avid mouth, swallowing, swallowing, and swallowing more and more people, subjectivities, and cultures.
Hoje, os botânicos, biólogos, antropólogos confirmaram, com seus estudos e pesquisas, que a floresta amazônica é resultado da manipulação, manejo através das práticas tecnológicas tradicionais dos povos indígenas. E com seus artefatos tecnológicos tradicionais, transformaram e enriqueceram a biodiversidade e a floresta amazônica sem destruir, desmatar as florestas ou poluir os rios e bacias hidrográficas.
Today, botanists, biologists, and anthropologists have confirmed with their studies and research that the Amazon rainforest is the result of manipulation and management through traditional technological practices of indigenous peoples that, with their traditional technological artifacts, have transformed and enriched the biodiversity of the Amazon rainforest without destroying or deforesting it, without polluting its rivers.
Comprovaram que as civilizações indígenas da Amazônia, ao longo de milhares de anos, são acompanhadas por florestas antropogênicas, que quer dizer, a expansão das civilizações indígenas não resulta na destruição da floresta, mas do contrário, no incremento da biodiversidade. As florestas da Amazônia são florestas antropogênicas, cultivadas e manejadas pela ação humana.
They have proved that the indigenous civilizations of the Amazon through thousands of years have been accompanied by anthropogenic forests, meaning that the expansions of indigenous civilizations did not result in the destruction of the forest, but rather in increasing its biodiversity. Amazon's forests are anthropogenic forests, cultivated and managed by human action.
Grande gulosa cobra, gulosa e egoísta, fortalecendo nosso mundo de viver, através dos nossos pajés, rezadeiras e feiticeiros e feiticeiras, ancião e anciã. Aprendemos a linguagens ocidentais, trouxemos a escrita da boa palavra e sobrevivemos. E estamos em nossos territórios produzindo e ressignificando em um enfrentamento silencioso como as onças, para continuarmos a nossa jornada terrena com dignidade, sabedoria e amor. Fazemos ações tímidas, precárias aos olhos ocidentais, como no pássaro martim pescador. Importante para garantir a nossa segurança dos nossos territórios, a tradição dos nossos costumes, os remédios das florestas, as curas dos mares, que na pandemia Covid-19, a utilização dessas medicinas foram significativas para não morrermos por mais um ataque biológico. Utilizamos o que nos foi ensinado, o nosso pensamento coletivo.
Great greedy snake. We are an indigenous nation which has suffered almost extermination with the rubber cycles during both Great World Wars. We survived. We flourished in the middle of chaos. We reorganized ourselves. We came out of the belly of the greedy and selfish great snake. We have strengthened our way of living through our shamans, our healers, our sorcerers and sorceresses, our elders. We learned the Western languages. We adopted the writing to write the good word, and we survived. And we are in our territories producing, reproducing, and resignifying in a silent confrontation, like the jaguars, to continue our earthly journey with dignity, wisdom, and love. Our actions may appear shy, precarious to Western eyes, such as the kingbird fisherman. But they're important to ensure the safety of our territories, the tradition of our customs, the remedies of the forest, and the cure of different evils. During the pandemic of COVID-19, the use of these medicines was significant, so that we did not die from another biological attack. We used what we had been taught, our collective thinking.
Eu sou Kowawa, Pupykary, Apurinã, filha de Saquema, neta de Cassato, irmã de Camara, Quimil e Camero, amiga das estrelas, amante das águas profundas, e que os deuses e deusas de todos os territórios e universos que são da boa palavra nos ensine a caminhar sobre o único lugar que pertencemos, que é o nosso berço humanitário na terra. Meu sangue é terra. Obrigada.
I am Kowawa, Pupykary Apurinã, daughter of Saquema, granddaughter of Cassato, sister of Camaro, Quimio, and Camero, friend of the stars, lover of deep water. And may the gods of all territories and universes, which are of the good words, teach us to walk on the one place we belong, which is our humanitarian cradle on earth. My blood is earth.
She says she's very happy. Words of power. ¿sí? Tus palabras están muy poderosas. Muchas gracias.
Gratidão a todas as pessoas que estão me vendo e estão ouvindo de coração. Nós, povos indígenas, estamos aqui para que vocês nos compreendam. Mesmo que eu não fale inglês, um francês tão bom, mas eu quero que vocês escutem o meu povo, porque a gente só pode tornar o mundo melhor quando nós nos ouvimos uns aos outros, umas às outras. Gratidão, gratidão, gratidão.
I can translate that one. She just wanted to say thank you very much, that she doesn't speak French or English, but that she is so happy that you guys are here to listen to her, and that she's hoping for a better world, and that Indigenous people have to be heard. That's what this panel was made for you, for people to be heard. And we actually have another wonderful, wonderful person that I'm so happy. Is he here? I'm so happy that you're going to be able to meet him. Sherman. There he is. Hi, Sean. Hi, Sean.
Guys.
Hi. Did you hear everything, Sean? Did you hear everything while Kowawa was speaking? So
Yeah,
I've introduced you quickly before, but I wanted to share this with you. So I've known of Sean before, and it was very important for me to discover more of his work. And last year, I was working on a consumption guide, a food guide, on how to consume better. A guide that's here, and it's available for free digitally. It's called Eat Like You Care. You can get it online on Instagram, on our website. And I discovered the incredible work of Sean, and I was really moved by it. And there's actually some of his recipes are on there. And I also wanted to honor a very recent ancestor, my mother, who was in there too. You can see her here with her beautiful pigtails. It's a very special guide because we feature not only modern day food, how to eat today, but also how to eat like our ancestors. And again, we have a beautiful story about Sean's work, what he does every day, how he brings knowledge to, and a link to how food is linked to our history. But Sean, I'm going to let you present all the beautiful work that you do. And Kowawa is staying here too to support you, as Hindou did before.
Okay. Hamatakiape, Anhepi Washte, Wambli Watakpe Anichiapi. My name is Sean Sherman. I am a member of the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe in the United States, and I am a chef, and I own one of the only native decolonized restaurants in the entire United States. And I'm just going to talk to you guys a little bit about our perspective of Indigenous foods and the importance of it, and how we can work towards reclamation, and how we just really need to be aware. So my story, of course, lies here in the United States, and you know, my story as being a chef, it really comes from one day just kind of having the realization of the complete absence of Indigenous foods anywhere out there. And even having grown up on a tribal community where my ancestors less than 100 years ago still contained 100% of their Indigenous knowledge base, it was still completely removed for me growing up. So I spent quite a few years researching, and then started actively pursuing and doing Indigenous foods in real time, and trying to find a way to bring modern Indigenous foods into today's world. So I'm going to run through a PowerPoint with you guys, and there's a lot of slides, so I'm going to move a little bit fast, but I want to try and get a good story in for you in the time that we have. So part of this is really just understanding how to reclaim Indigenous foodways, and how do we move forward, and what does it even mean to decolonize our foods. So I always like to start with just understanding what that word means, and the only way to understand what decolonize means is to truly understand the term colonialism. So quite simply, colonialism is just the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. And as Indigenous peoples, we know this very well. This is something that is obviously not unique to North America, because it happens in both Americas, North and South, Africa, India, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. And we see this need to help to steward Indigenous knowledge bases and Indigenous foodways on a global scale. And we can start it really right now today. And for us in the United States, this all really stems from European powers, the colonialism that happens to us, like in many other countries, and stemming from Manifest Destiny, which for the United States, it was their term of, that was kind of came from the doctrine of discovery, which gave them the right to own anything they discovered. And the United States government does exactly that over a very short period of time. So I always like to look at what happens, because as Indigenous peoples, we've just been through centuries of racism and white supremacy. And how do we even attempt to stand up to that when it's still happening in today's world? Obviously, with the story of Brazil that you guys just listened to, these things are active right now today. We have not even exited an era of colonialism yet in the world. And we have a lot of work to do. So for us as Indigenous peoples, we were also a heavy part of the slave trade, where there was 5.5 million Indigenous peoples just on the East Coast during the periods of 1500 to 1900. And that's rarely talked about here, even in the United States. And you just have to remember how young we are over here, because again, the United States was barely a new government in the year 1800, and we were still at war with Great Britain. And the reality of what was going on with the rest of North America was all of our Indigenous communities still stewarding so much Indigenous land space, despite European countries coming over and claiming large tracts of land with no actual basis. But this is where we are, and what forms as the United States doesn't even really happen until the mid 1800s. Until we get to where we are today. So during this time period of so much loss of land space and so much removal of Indigenous peoples, we see a lot of our food access being completely wiped off the map, and across North America. We see ecocide, like you learned about a moment ago, happening during this time period, where just massive old growth forests were completely mowed down, and our environment changes before our eyes as Indigenous peoples, and everything just really is devastating for so many of our communities. And not only that, but we saw so much destruction of crops and seeds, because there was so much amazing Indigenous agriculture happening across large portions of North America. And we have no idea how many heirloom seeds have been completely lost to time as of now. And, you know, we see so much aggressive action happening against Indigenous peoples, so many just murders and just genocide in general. I live in a state where we had a bounty system where people can get up to $200 for the body part of an Indigenous person in the 1860s. And if you do the inflation rate of how much $200 was back then, it's an immense amount of money. We also, for myself, we were very connected to an animal, the American bison, which was systematically destroyed by the U.S. government, because the U.S. government decided it'd be easier to remove a food source to take out the Indigenous peoples, which is exactly what they did, and spent a decade completely wiping out hundreds of millions of these animals with the sole purpose of weakening Indigenous communities so it could take over their land spaces, and just the full colonial machine in effect at that moment. We also just, you know, it's just really disturbing to read these pieces through history that never make it. We're going through such a weird time in American history where some states are basically banning people in schools to teach about true history of what happened here with Black and Indigenous peoples and the history of that. The loss of our education was probably the most damning thing for us as Indigenous peoples. So at the turn of the century, in the late 1800s and 1900s, my grandparents' generation, they're forced to go to boarding schools where they're forced to learn English language, learn Christianity, cut their hair, and and try to be completely non-Indigenous. So these assimilation efforts are still withstanding and have been extremely detrimental. And we've lost so much culture through these educational assimilation efforts. And these children were subjected to a lot of horrors, and we're just now slowly starting to find out how awful these school systems were for, again, people in my grandparents' generation. My grandparents' generation should have been downloading thousands of years of knowledge from Indigenous peoples and history of how to grow with the land, how to identify plants, and how to harvest, and how to do everything as Indigenous. But instead, the United States government tries to turn Indigenous children into something that they're not. We have these boarding schools all over what is the United States today and all over Canada, known as residential schools. And so many of this lasting damage, these kids are subjected to so much physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, and we're still reeling from that within our communities today. And we just have to remember these stories. And the 1900s to the 2000s weren't much better because my grandparents weren't even citizens until 1924. We go through a few decades of more relocation through the 1940s through 1960s. We have the Indian adoption era of 1941 to 1967, where the statistic is 1 out of 3 Native children are completely removed from their homes and put into non-Indigenous communities as another form of assimilation and stripping of Indigenous cultures, which a lot of people my age had to go through. We were banned from practicing our own religions until 1978 here in the US. So growing up in post-colonial Native America, which doesn't really exist because we're still living in very colonial times, my food system growing up was primarily government subsidies of all sorts of government cheese, government powdered milk, government grains, government flours, and just a lot of over-salted and over-sugared foods. And our communities are suffering from upwards to 60% type 2 diabetes, immense amount of obesity, and lots of heart disease, and all these foodborne illnesses that come directly from this nutritional source that we have. And it's just, for me, this is part of the impetus of wanting to do something different, especially as a chef, and wanting to get a change out there so we all have access to Indigenous foods. So it's important we understand what Indigenous foods mean, and we can utilize this on a pan-Indigenous knowledge base for everywhere. So first off, it's just understanding biodiversity and just understanding like North America is a huge continent and there's so much biodiversity there. But then when you layer Indigenous peoples on top of that, one way to look at that is through a language map, and it's easy to see like how much amazing diversity we should be celebrating and uplifting to really understand a true sense of where we are, and knowing that all Indigenous peoples around the globe had the key understanding to live sustainably, utilizing primarily plant knowledge when it comes down to it. Today, we still have 634 tribes in Canada, 576 actually in the US, and 20% of Mexico identifies as Indigenous, with almost 8% of the population of Mexico still speaking Indigenous languages over European languages. So for us, it doesn't matter who's speaking English, French, or Spanish, because those are all European colonial languages. There's hundreds of Indigenous languages out there just across North America, even in just like one state like California, where there was so much diversity there. So it's really important that we make these understandings. So for us, moving forward with Indigenous education is a key part to this. So taking back what the US government stripped from us, which was our own education, which was the thousands of years of really useful and valuable knowledge being handed down that was systematically taken away from us. So when we're looking at Indigenous knowledge, it's all these pieces. It's wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, oceanography, hunting, fishing, animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, histories, medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, sustainability. Those are the curriculum that we should really be focused on moving forward. And, we should be really thinking highly about what kind of foods we're eating, because people should not be afraid of foods if it's a cow, if it doesn't happen to be a cow, a pig, or a chicken, because Indigenous peoples utilized so much different styles of proteins out there. And insect usage, of course, is so commonplace in so many places, and we should all be moving towards more sustainable protein choices for the future in general. But for us, the connection to plants was the most powerful piece to this, because if you just start to open up your eyes and look at the world around you with an indigenous perspective, you start to see nothing but food, medicine, and just finding that connection with the plant world all around us, and understanding what kind of carbohydrates are out there, and just that plant identification in general, and how people, especially indigenous people, have been utilizing the land for millennia to be able to survive healthy and happy, and be able to have enough food for their entire community, but utilizing food as a community situation. You know, it was not commodified in those days, at least over on this side of the world. And under just that plant knowledge of even like sea plants and water plants, there's just so much knowledge out there across the board, and in the deserts also. And agriculture is something that we really like to talk about here, because North American and just the agriculture in the Americas is so amazing. But we think that we're at the pinnacle of agriculture technology today, when we have a lot to relearn, because we know how much chemical and how much damage that style of farming is doing to our soil, and these really dangerous chemicals getting into our foods and getting into our communities and getting into our own bodies. So we should be very worried when we see news pieces that some of these traces of minerals or traces of dangerous chemicals are getting into our foods, which they just are. So when you look at North American agriculture, it goes way back, and it's a really amazing story of how indigenous peoples had figured out very organic farming practices and agricultural practices, and were able to feed millions of people, you know, for so long before Europeans ever stepped foot. And it's interesting to follow the history, and you can trace the migration of corn culture from the bottom of Mexico all the way up into parts of Canada, and all the way across the entire eastern seaboard, and all the different ways that indigenous peoples on this side of the world figured out how to farm long before they ever saw European people. And so it's so important that we take this time to steward indigenous seeds like our ancestors have, and make sure that these seeds stay in the hands of indigenous peoples in general. Because it's the indigenous peoples, these seeds carry so much commonplace with us, because they're our connection, they are our ancestors also, and we have to do everything we can to protect this diversity for future generations, and not homogenize all these pieces, and just really celebrate it. So the work that we're doing here right now, I'm just a chef. I'm in, like I said, I own a restaurant in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was born and raised on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which is where the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe live. And we just really wanted to do something that gave back to our indigenous ancestors, and start to reclaim a lot of the knowledge that was being stripped away or had been stripped away, and spending a lot of time outdoors, reconnecting with the world and the plants around us, and just starting to see food everywhere, and starting to bring that food back into the kitchen, and taking the time to relearn how to preserve foods, dry foods out, turn things into powders, and recreate our own indigenous pantry, so we can have access to creating healthy, modern indigenous foods that can stand up to some of the best restaurants out there, but also just making it accessible for our indigenous community, so they have access to this extremely healthy food base that we all need to be eating. So reclaiming indigenous health and culture through food is our main goal. I have a nonprofit here in the United States called Natives, and it's an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, where we have two main goals, which is creating access to indigenous education and creating access to indigenous foods. We're doing this through our nonprofit kitchen called Indigenous Food Lab, and we are just trying to get this knowledge out there, so we can understand the benefits of indigenous diet, which are lots of healthy fats, lots of diverse proteins, low carb, low salt, immense amount of plant diversity compared to the Western diet, organic agriculture, celebrating cultural and regional diversities, and just understanding how regional and seasonal based food systems work. And if we can work towards that, we can work towards getting to a true sense of indigenous food sovereignty, which is creating healthy food access, making sure that we're promoting cultural food producers and regional food systems, and that we have local control and non-governmental control of our food systems, having access to indigenous education, and having strong environmental protections in place to protect all of the wonderful stuff around us. And we're doing everything we can to help teach our young indigenous youth to do more community gardens, and to grow a lot of these these heirloom indigenous seeds that are still out there, and to think about permaculture, because we have the ability to landscape any way we want to, and we should just be putting food everywhere we absolutely can that likes to grow, just like a lot of our indigenous ancestors have, and create a world around us where it's just ripe with healthy food. We also need a new generation of people to understand how to process these foods in a safe manner so we do not make ourselves sick. So it's going to be really important that we create and support indigenous kitchens out there, so people have the chance to see and experience the amazing diversity of indigenous peoples and culture, because we truly believe that if you can control your food, you can control your destiny, like our indigenous ancestors from around the world. Our goal is to create regional center points all across North America through the Indigenous Food Lab, to be able to help create more Indigenous food operations and more access to health, and just really helping in the culture. So for us, this is an Indigenous evolution and revolution at the same time, utilizing food as our main language, because it's the one thing that we all have in common as Indigenous peoples. And we truly believe that we can get there and that the path is there, but we're going to have to work together, and we're going to need a lot of people working on this with us to help to steward this knowledge base for future generations, because we truly believe that the future is Indigenous, and we are going to do everything we can to help humanity live better, accept diversity, be better connected to the earth, and to take care of the earth, and to move forward with that situation. So that's my little story. I could go a lot more with that, but I know we had kind of a tight time frame.
No, you...
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much. We still have a bit of time. I have a couple of minutes with you, and I know you travel all around North America. Right now, you're in the East Coast, and you literally work...
Northern Michigan,
Yeah.
in the Great Lakes.
You're in the Great Lakes, and your mission is really also to obviously use your voice through food. Your methodology is through food, but you're also very poetic, and I invite everyone in the audience or listening to watch your TED Talk, which was one of the best TED Talks I've watched. So thank you for that. Thank you for being a part of this community, and I love how you weaved in not just North American Indigenous people, but at large. You're looking at the whole scope of Indigenous people. Are we going to be someday soon, seeing a recipe book made of all Indigenous foods? Because, you know, Hindou at the beginning of the conversation spoke of her wanting to go and meet other Indigenous people around the world. Maybe you should join her and create a cookbook.
Yeah, we actually have a cookbook out right now called the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. It's been out since 2018. And we also are working on a second cookbook that's looking at all of North America, from Mexico through Alaska, to explore and promote and uplift all the amazing diversity across that land space through that Indigenous perspective.
That's great. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel. It means a lot to me, and I hope it was interesting for all of you. I know you don't know this, Sean, but it's super hot in Paris. It's incredibly hot. If that's not a sign of global warming, I don't know what is. But there are two things I wanted to share before we leave. I know you've been here a long time, you're troopers. The two most important things I thought were important to share is, one, first, a very short story. Yesterday, when we were getting ready at the speaker's lounge, one of the ChangeNOW volunteer came up to Kowawa and said, "And I know you, I recognize you." And he was really, really impressed to see her. And she said, "Well, no one knows me here, no one recognized me here." And he turns out to be from Brazil, and his parents, obviously he's Indigenous himself. And I thought it was very interesting. In a way, I felt that there was such a great analogy to the fundamental of, for me, that Indigenous people are never lost wherever they go. They're never lost because their GPS is the planet, is the moon and the sun, and that's how they find their way. Their compass is nature. And I feel like when your compass is nature, you're never lost. If we're lost today as humans, we can easily find our way. In Western civilization, obviously, I see that our compass is technology most of the time. We're using more and more of it. If we go back to that Mother Nature compass, we will never be lost. I think we will never be lost as well. So we are not lost. We just need to use a different compass. And in closing, I'd like to share this with you, particularly, Sean, because I feel like you're such a great representation of this. And again, thank you so much. I know you have an incredible, incredible busy schedule, but I honor in particular, because they welcomed me with such open arms when I was very young, to learn so much about everything that I know today and that I use every day with ChangeNOW, about circular economy, about sharing, about understanding seeds with the Cree Nations of Alberta. When the blood in your veins returns to the sea and the earth in your bones returns to the ground, perhaps then you will remember that this land does not belong to you. It is you who belong to this land. Thank you all. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Kowawa. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you.